Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the Trusting the God of the Gospel webinar. If you're here, we're kind of assuming that you're perhaps a parent, perhaps you're a youth worker, maybe a Christian counselor, or in some way, shape, or form you live with or work with adopted or foster children and teenagers. And that's what we want to talk about today. My name is ArthurCWoods, and I'm really excited that you could be with us today. And I think the next 25 to 30 minutes is going to be valuable to you, something that you can take away today and actually implement with the children and teenagers that you live with and work with. So here goes. I wanted to first start off by letting you know that some of the material that we'll be talking about today actually comes from our Trusting the God of the Gospel DVD curriculum, which we came out with in 2019, and it's designed for adoptive and foster parents to help talk to their teenagers about God. So while today's webinar is not specific to teenagers, we did want to let you know that some of the material that we'll be talking about today actually comes out of the curriculum we created specifically for teenagers. So we'll give you a little bit more information about that as the webinar winds down. I want to start with a question maybe some of you are going to find extremely easy. Others of you may have never even considered this question, but here it is. What is the difference between mentorship and discipleship? What's the difference between mentorship and discipleship? Maybe you're not even sure if there is a difference. And I would say this. I think those two terms get used interchangeably very often. Mentorship, discipleship. Sometimes you throw in coaching, sometimes you throw in counseling or therapy, and it all kind of gets mixed together in terms of being the same thing. But I would argue that discipleship is actually very different than mentorship. With mentorship, you can really mentor someone in any number of areas. You can mentor someone about their finances, about their academics, about their career, whatever the case may be. You can mentor someone about just about anything. With discipleship, we have a bit more of a narrowed focus. With discipleship, we're talking about entering into a relationship with someone to help that person become closer to Jesus Christ. The emphasis on discipleship is all about Jesus. So in a sense, discipleship is a type of mentorship, or discipleship is a type of coaching. But when we're talking about discipleship, especially in tonight's context, we're talking about you as parents or youth workers having relationships with children or teenagers with the specified goal of bringing them closer to Jesus. And that's discipleship. So with that in mind, I think that kind of brings us to the next question, which would be this. Why would the discipleship needs of adopted and foster children and teenagers be different than that of someone else? So for example, you could disciple anyone at any age or any stage of life, but what makes it different if the person you're discipling is an adopted or foster child or teenager? And I think for me, it boils down to one single word, and that word is this: trauma. I would argue that every single adopted or foster child or teenager has experienced trauma in their life. Even if they had a relatively wonderful life, at some point they still have to deal with the fact that they can't be with their biological mother or father. And that in itself is traumatizing. And that's before you even talk about the fact that many of our adopted and foster children and teenagers have gone through very specific trauma related to abuse, neglect, abandonment. So I think we see that the primary thing that makes the discipleship unique of adopted and foster children and teenagers is the fact that they have experienced trauma. So what is trauma? And I like the way Darren Jones from Texas Christian University defines it. He says this: trauma is the experience of multiple, chronic, and prolonged developmentally adverse traumatic events, and here's the part I want to emphasize, most often of an interpersonal nature. Most often of an interpersonal nature. So what do we take away from that definition? Trauma is connected to relationships. Now, obviously, you can be traumatized in a number of ways. You could get in a car accident and be traumatized. You could go off to war and be traumatized. But for our purposes today, we're talking about trauma as a result of a relationship that a child or teenager had or has that has been hurtful in some way, shape, or form. One of the things that we know about trauma is that it affects us in 5 separate domains. You may have heard this before. It's the 5 B's of trauma. Trauma affects our brain, our biology, our body, our behavior, and our beliefs. 5 separate areas. And if you work with kids who have been traumatized, or you live with kids that have been traumatized, I would bet that as you listen to that list, you can think, yeah, I can see exactly how my child, how my teenager has been impacted in each of those domains. But the domain that I want to focus on tonight, the domain that I feel is most relevant to a discussion on discipleship of adopted and foster children and teenagers, is beliefs. Trauma affects our beliefs, and more specifically, trauma affects what we believe about God. Trauma can affect what we believe about God, about the gospel, about Jesus, about faith, about the Bible, about how we should live. So it becomes important as parents, as youth workers, to consider the trauma that our children, that our teenagers have been through as we think about how we best disciple them. In fact, we would call that trauma-informed discipleship. It's the idea of taking into consideration a child or a teenager's past hurts, their past trauma, or maybe even their current hurts or their current trauma, taking all of that into consideration as we present the good news of Jesus Christ to the kids that we live with and work with. Trauma-informed discipleship is intentionally presenting the gospel with an understanding of one's past hurts. Okay, so as you think about the idea that our children, our teenagers have been affected by trauma, and that trauma affects what we believe or what they believe about God, what are some of those gospel concepts or biblical phrases or biblical ideas that might become troublesome to an adopted or foster child or teenager? If I gave you all a bunch of time to really think through the gospel, to think through what it looks like to disciple one of your children or one of your teenagers, I bet you could start listing out a lot of words, a lot of phrases, a lot of concepts that could be difficult for an adopted or foster child or teenager to embrace. For example, father, the gospel concept of father, where God says, I am your father. And for many of us, that is a beautiful analogy that we embrace. We love the idea of God as our father. But what if our kids, many of them, have not had a great experience with father here on earth? In fact, maybe they had a horrible experience with father. And so when God comes in and says, I am like your father, or I am your father, some of our kids don't want to hear that because of their past, because of their trauma directly related to their father. They don't want to hear that God is their father. What about the gospel concept of love, that God says, I love you? Well, what does love look like to some of our kids who have come from hurt, who have difficult pasts, who have trauma? What does love look like? Maybe for them, love here on earth was very temporary. Maybe for them, love here on earth was even abusive. Maybe for them, love here on earth was bitter or evil or mean. So when God comes along and says, I love you, what does love mean to some of those kids, to some of our kids who have never really experienced love to begin with? In fact, I once had an adopted teenager tell me these words, I don't believe in love. That word is meaningless. And the reason she thought that is because of all the past experiences she had with people who, quote unquote, loved her. And the fact that that love was temporary and that love wasn't real. So when God is telling her that he loves her, she doesn't want to hear it. And I kind of understand that. I bet you understand that too. What about other gospel concepts like trust? How do we trust God if all the people on earth that we were supposed to trust have stabbed us in the back? What about forgiveness? What about the idea that God has forgiven us and in return we should be forgiving others? Well, that's kind of hard to do when you've been hurt very severely by people in your life, people that you're not able to forgive. Or maybe it was something that our kids did that no one was able to forgive them for. So when God says, I have forgiven you, therefore you should forgive others, do our kids even know what forgiveness is? Are they able to forgive? Have they ever in any way experienced forgiveness, whether it's forgiving others or being forgiven by others? That's another tricky gospel concept. What about the idea of control? When God is talking about giving up control of your life to Him. You know, a lot of our adopted and foster children and teenagers have never had control of anything. At the most important moments of their life, someone else was making the decisions, whether it was a biological parent, whether it was a social worker, whether it was a teacher, whether it was a foster parent or an adoptive parent. A lot of these kids have never experienced control, and some of them desperately want it. And then here we say, give God control of your life. And they just think, no, I have given enough people control of my life, and it didn't turn out well. So why would I want to give God control of my life? What about identity? You know, especially into the teenage years, teenagers are desperately searching for their identities, desperately seeking where they fit in, asking themselves the question, who am I? And here comes the Bible, here comes the gospel saying, I'll tell you who your identity is. You are a child of God. And for me, that sounds like a great identity. I love the fact that I'm a child of God. I embrace the fact that I'm a child of God. But if I'm a traumatized teenager, if I'm a traumatized child, maybe I'm not going to be too quick to want to identify quite so quickly with being a child of God. Maybe I want to explore the other options, the other things that I can identify with. So it's another difficult gospel concept. And we could go on and on and on about biblical words, phrases, gospel concepts that are going to be difficult for our adopted and foster children and teenagers to embrace as a result of the trauma that they have experienced. Now remember, trauma affects our beliefs. Trauma affects our beliefs in God and the gospel. So as we're presenting the good news of Jesus Christ to our kids, remember that they have trauma and that it might just be affecting how easily they can embrace the message that you're delivering to them. So with all of that in mind, then how do we deliver that message? If we're understanding that, okay, there's so many gospel concepts that might be difficult for our adopted and foster children and teenagers to embrace, how in the world do we communicate the gospel to them in a way that they can embrace, in a way that is more palatable to them? Well, first I would say this: we're not changing the gospel message. God has given us His word. God has given us the gospel story, and we're not going to change it. It doesn't need to be changed. God has given us the gospel story, and we're not going to change that. But we can certainly adjust how we communicate that message based on who we're talking to. So as we get to know the past hurts, the past experiences, the trauma of the children, of the teenagers that we live with and work with, we'll start to better equip ourselves to be able to present the gospel. One caveat here I would make is that we're talking about discipleship. We're not talking about counseling. We're not talking about therapy. Many of our traumatized children and teenagers have significant mental and emotional issues that need to be addressed by mental health professionals. We're not talking about taking the place of those mental health professionals, but we are talking about stepping into a discipleship role where we are communicating the good news of Jesus Christ to the kids that we live with and work with. So one of the tips that I would give you that I think is going to be really valuable to you as you consider how you're going to leave and go communicate the gospel to the kids that you live with and work with is this. For many of us, the gospel message has been a comparative analogy. Let me explain what I mean by that. When I first came to Christ, someone explained the gospel to me, and they explained some of the analogies that God uses to help us understand the relationship that we can have with him. And one of those great relationships is the father-son relationship that he desperately wants to have with us. Now, I had a very good father growing up. Doesn't mean I had a perfect father, but I had a very good father. And that means when I heard that God is like my father, or God is my father, it wasn't a difficult concept for me to embrace, because I look at my earthly father and I say, hey, this is a good guy. I can understand, okay, God's like my father. I get it. That's a good comparison. I understand it. I embrace that. God is my heavenly father. Done. But think about if your experiences with an earthly father were horrible, were abusive, were neglectful. Maybe there was abandonment. It's going to be difficult, as we said earlier, for you to embrace God as Father. So as we communicate the gospel to some of these traumatized teenagers and children, we can think about the gospel not as a comparative analogy, but actually as a contrasting analogy. So we say to them, you experienced Father here on earth in this way. This is what it looked like. This is what Father means to you. This was your experience of fatherhood. Now let's contrast that. We're not comparing it, we're contrasting that with what God is offering when he says, I'm going to be your father. I want to be your father. Let's contrast that. Another example of comparison or contrasting would be the gospel concept of love. Depending on the experiences that these kids had with love, they may not embrace a comparative analogy of love within the gospel message. But if we say this, here's what you experienced as far as love goes here on earth. Maybe it was abusive, neglectful. Maybe it didn't really exist. Here's what you experienced as love. We're going to contrast that. Again, we're contrasting that with the love that God is offering. And maybe at that point we open up to 1 Corinthians 13 and we start reading about the perfect agape love that God is offering. And we contrast that with what our children, our teenagers experienced here on earth. And that might begin to be a little bit more palatable to them to say, all right, this is what I experienced on earth, but this is what God is offering. This is the Father that I experienced on earth, but this is what God is offering. And as we go through so many of these biblical words, these gospel concepts, we can say, here's what you experienced, but here's what God is saying. Here's what you understand, but here's what God is communicating to us through the gospel. So it becomes a contrast instead of a comparison. And I think that's going to be one of the keys to help you better communicate the gospel message, to communicate the good news of Jesus Christ to the adopted and foster children and teenagers that you live with and work with. Now, there's a lot of other strategies that we could go through, and we're not going to take the time to do that today. But I did want to let you know that many of these strategies are available in the Trusting the God of the Gospel DVD curriculum that we came out with last year. I want to encourage you to check out that material, see if it's right for you, and if it is, pick up a copy or two, because I really believe that if you have a heart to disciple the children, the teenagers that you live with, that you work with, this is going to be an important tool kind of in your discipleship arsenal, if you will. It's going to take some of the principles that we talked about already today, unpack them even more, and give you a lot more tips on how you can better communicate the gospel to these adopted and foster children and teenagers. It's an 8-session DVD. Each session has an introductory video, followed by a downloadable PDF workbook, and within that workbook are discussion questions, our activities, our scripture memorization, our personal reflection questions, all to get a teenager thinking about what it means to embrace God as Father, or to embrace the good news of Jesus Christ. And we'll go through a lot of the gospel concepts that we already talked about today. We're going to go through them one by one, unpack them, and give you ways that you can communicate those gospel concepts to the teenagers that you live with and work with. So again, while today This webinar was about children and teenagers. The curriculum itself actually is specifically about teenagers. It's for parents, it's for youth workers, for anyone that lives with adopted and foster teenagers that wants to be able to communicate the good news of Jesus Christ. I'd encourage you to check it out. There's a link right here in the webinar that you can click on it. You can order your copy and get that really quickly. So a couple other ways that you can follow up on this material. Number one, my wife and I have done a 10 series limited edition podcast that you can find on Apple Podcast or wherever you consume your podcast, called Trusting the God of the Gospel. Just type in Trusting the God of the Gospel. It'll come up, and it's going to go deeper into some of the concepts that we talked about today. So check that out if it's of interest to you. The second place I might direct you is to just jump on over to Facebook, type in Trusting the God of the Gospel, and join us on our Facebook page, where we post links, we post quotes, we post blogs, we post videos, we post podcasts, all designed to help you as a parent or a youth worker talk to adopted and foster children and teenagers about God. So check that out as well. And again, go ahead and click on the link for the DVD curriculum. Get your copy of that. I think it's going to be really, really valuable as you seek to talk to adopted and foster teenagers about God. Well, I think that's about it for today. I hope the past several minutes have been valuable to you. I hope you've taken some nuggets from this information that you can go even today and talk to an adopted or foster child or teenager that you live with or work with about the good news of Jesus Christ. As Christians, we have an incredible message to communicate. God has given us the gospel, and it is perfect and it is beautiful. And how we choose to communicate that to those in our lives is so important. So thanks again, everyone, for being part of today's webinar. I'll be thinking about you as you enter in those conversations with your adopted and foster children and teenagers about how they can better trust the God of the gospel. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.